Wanting to talk about borderline and autism for quite some time. I've made, I think, a video or two just kind of summarizing things, but I really wanted to dive into this topic with you today. About a year ago, I became really fascinated in understanding complex trauma as it related to the potential of understanding something like high masking autism. And because I've already spent so much time trying to understand the impact of borderline in both of my parents and many of those I work with who have come to me and most often realizing historically that one or both of their parents had struggled or struggles with something like borderline or narcissism, and how all of this new research on trauma and neurodevelopmental disorders in the brain, like it's all just so fascinating. And I have started to question, not only am I on the spectrum, but is my mom? I do not have, it's a whole story. I've referenced it here or there. I'll talk about it more at some point. Theoretically, I only recently found out who my biological father was through a website. My mom had lied to me until I was 42 and said, by the way, the person that you thought was your father, who took his own life at 23, when I was 23 and he was in his 50s, is not your father. And everyone in the family knew except for me. Like, it's a whole thing. But my point is, I don't have data around the genetics of something like autism. What I can tell you is that I do believe my mom struggles with borderline for sure. I do believe that because of the stereotypes around borderline, even though my mom may have hit some because she did not hit the highly at risk population, I was in my a doctoral program after a master's degree when I realized that that is what was going on for her. I'm still dabbling with, could it also be autism, but I don't have, that's the only person I have. I don't have a lot of other family resources. I have no siblings, things like that. So, for example, we know that both autism and borderline have a strong genetic and hereditary and environmental related component in some fashion in varying degrees for both of them. And so it gets tricky. The point is trying to understand trauma, autism, borderline. And the only reason why I think the labels matter, not in order to pathologize, frankly, but in order to validate, like I've said in so many videos, when I understood that my mom had this dynamic, it finally allowed me to make sense around it. So then, as I'm saying, I realized also that my father, my non-biological father, who had a lot of trauma, definitely meets the criteria in my memory, which is hard to put together, but knowing how emotionally dysregulated he was so often, there definitely were narcissistic pieces, but another part that feels very much like it was borderline. And we know now that even though women are the ones who are diagnosed with borderline, that it occurs similarly among men. I'm using men and women in this language because I'm talking about the research, but I want to honor that it can present for however you identify, whoever you are, in its own formats. It's just hard to use that language. I haven't quite figured that out with research. So if you have a way for me to say that, please share it. But when I'm talking about the research, for example, that there is strong emerging evidence of a female phenotype of autism, I'll link the articles down below. They're all in the last year or so. It gets kind of hard to understand. And so I know I just took a turn there, but the point is, like, with something like borderline in men, it does exist. We just haven't been able to identify it. We've called it something else. We've missed it. For example, a lot of men in prison, it turns out, who are incarcerated often end up receiving a diagnosis of borderline. It's that it manifests and the way that it navigates in their system and what they're allowed to do or not do, frankly, changes how it plays out, right? So violence among men is more tolerated, things like that. And so it's important to know all of that. So that has really driven this understanding. And then I've had so many people ask me to talk about this on social media. And I posted a video, I think last week, just like a music video with some information, but I really wanted to do the deep dive myself. So here we are. All right. So I'm going to put up some graphics as we go through. I'm not sure this is going to flow as easily as I'd like it to. We're going to kind of go back and forth between ASD and BPD. But the goal is for you to really, by the time we get to the graphic that I'm going to provide for you through the research articles I found, really understand why that overlap is so significant. And the reason why it's a problem is that because autism, especially now they're calling it high functioning. We don't love that term, I know. But that's the term in the literature. We're talking about high masking, really, autism in this female phenotype that has truly been emerging more and more because it presents so differently, because the research has been done mostly on white males and no one else outside of that population has truly been, it's happening more, but has truly been studied. The way it looks, just like male BPD, looks completely different in many cases. So that's a problem because the treatments are going to be different. And by the way, you can also have autism and have borderline. That's important. But there's been a lot of people who are actually autistic who were diagnosed as borderline. And lastly, the role of trauma is significant because we know, for example, to have autism, pretty much it just goes without saying, you're going to also have trauma. They're so woven together. Even if you had, the most perfect childhood with parents who saw your autism somehow and had all the tools, that the world is going to be inherently traumatic in some way. But also we know that trauma with borderline is a huge piece of borderline. So it is not 100% trauma driven. I was going to say borderline driven. But we know that trauma plays a huge role. So what is autism? Autism spectrum disorder is a heterogeneous neurodevelopmental disorder characterized by difficulties around communication, social interaction, often defined by patterns of repetitive behavior, a strong preference for routines, often restrictive interests, and certain types of patterned behaviors. Okay, now the next question is then, well, what is borderline, right? Borderline is characterized by a pervasive pattern of really mood instability, relational instability. It's like this storminess around the person's often relationships with themselves and others, sense of self-image, their mood often, being variable in that regard, dysregulation emotionally, and difficulty with things like impulse control, among other issues, right? So there's this piece where these two can present in similar ways. For example, can BPD mimic autism? How might it do that? Both autism and borderline individuals can apparently present a similar pattern of interpersonal relationships, identity disturbance, impulsivity, affective lability, and difficulty controlling anger. So why that happens can be similar and yet different, and we're going to talk about what often drives that, for example, in dysregulation. But it's important to just hold that the picture, the snapshot, can have a lot of those similar dynamics on the surface, okay? So as I said, because there's been this dynamic because of that snapshot being so similar, oftentimes autistic girls are being undiagnosed and women misdiagnosed or diagnosed later in life. And that the reason is, like I said, there is this emerging evidence around a female phenotype with a unique symptomatology and a different clinical presentation and associated comorbidities. What does that mean? That means associated other difficulties, depression, borderline, OCD, EDs, things like that. And that because the tools that have been developed so far, as I said earlier, have been really developed on this white male population, they're not really sensitive enough to make the fine-tuning nuances about what it could look like and present like in girls and women. And that is a problem because, once again, if you don't know what you're looking for, but you're looking for something, you will find something. It may not be the accurate treatment and course of most support for somebody. And so one of the pieces I want you to hold in mind as we get into the differences between borderline and autism comes from this statement in the article, and it says this: interestingly, and I'll break it down in a second, interestingly, a central feature of ASD that has recently gained more interest is an alteration in sensory processing that occurs when the ability to respond behaviorally to sensory information, including sound, touch, body movement, sight, taste, and smell, is diminished. This alteration can ultimately lead to unusual responses to sensory inputs, which may impair the daily life activities of ASD subjects. What does all that mean? That means that this sensory piece, which we're going to talk about for those with autism, can be a driver for dysregulation, right? So let's look at it this way. Let's say I have autism and you have borderline, okay? And we have on the surface, we're both having an emotional meltdown. And on the surface, it looks like it has something to do with a relationship dynamic, okay? What this is saying is that because of the sensory piece being so prominent in autism, that what often drives that meltdown for somebody with autism can be a disruption, an overstimulation, a quick and sudden response to that sensory piece being overwhelming. Whereas for the person with borderline, we're assuming there's no overlap, okay? That their dysregulation, their meltdown, I don't love that word, but their emotional bigness, right, or wound is actually coming from an attachment injury. We know that those who have, seriously, as we know, trauma can fuel borderline in varying degrees, but that because there's a lot of often emotional, relational disruption and lack of safety for the child, let's say, who developed borderline, that they are going to be more sensitive to injuries around attachment wounds and relationships, right? As I've talked so much about, the research shows a lot of parents who have disorganized attachment, where the source of safety is also the source of fear, they tend to have a good puzzle piece fit with, theoretically, it could be autism, we know, but let's say on the surface of something like borderline, where there's a lot of needing to be hypervigilant and pay attention. The parent can be lovely and safe or dissociated, or a lot of unresolved trauma in their own right. But like I've said with my situation, my dad had that, my mom did not, but the behaviors were similar in different ways. The point is, on the outside, the disruption, the meltdown looks the same. I've talked about, I just did this, I think, last week. One of my dogs, smell is a big trigger for me, and it could be anything, but like sometimes it makes me feel enraged. Like if I'm trying to do something and I smell something, it's like misophonia, where you have someone's chewing and you go into a rage response. It really is a neurological response. And so, but on the outside, it could look like I just can't, I'm mad at the dog, right? But the difference is, or my boyfriend or my girlfriend or partner or whatever. But it really is about that sensory drive versus I'm perceiving that you're rejecting me as an attachment injury with borderline. I'm perceiving that you don't like me. I'm perceiving that you're trying to hurt me. Now, this is where it gets tricky, is that with autism, because of the need to mask and to be hypervigilant around any perceptions of being perceived in ways that could lead to rejection, that could also set a person up to have similarities with borderline as well. So that gets to a whole other level, but that's important to understand. The other piece is that anxiety is huge for autism, right? That we know that I always say, now that I'm, working with more people who are thinking they're on the spectrum or know they are, I almost pretty much automatically assume that they struggle with some form of anxiety. I'm not saying I don't ask them about it eventually or try to understand it, but the point is that in their intakes, it's clear. In the often, files they give me, things like that. There's anxiety all over the place. And that's a huge piece, that not just anxiety, but also alexithymia, which can be another dynamic with autism. But that those kind of things kind of tend to just go along with autism. And when you're talking about anxiety, you're often talking about hypervigilance. You're often talking about this increased sensitivity to everything and everyone. And that can also be happening in borderline, but in more ways for borderline, it's like you're scanning for probably rejection and abandonment most. Whereas in autism, that might be there, but you're also scanning for everything, nonverbal, verbal, sensory feedback, all of that stuff. Then you get into how all of this connects, and one article says that according to recent literature, up to 50% of those with autism may also meet the criteria for at least one personality disorder. And that's because I think there's all this overlap, and because the trauma piece often weighs heavily in shaping. And then, of course, we have genetics and the environment and brain changes and all of that. So it gets tricky in that regard. And I want to read this to you. It says, although the two disorders, talking about borderline and autism, seem quite different, recent literature increasingly reported significant overlaps. The two disorders mainly differentiate for the presence, this is talking about autism, of restricted interests and repetitive behaviors, as well as an alteration in sensory processing that, while being necessary for the diagnosis of ASD, it is not required for that of borderline. On the other hand, while borderline is characterized by a pervasive instability of relationship and self-image, feelings of emptiness, and desperate efforts to avoid abandonment, those are not required features for a diagnosis of ASD. Moreover, the two disorders often report, like I just said, different triggers of emotional upset. For example, in ASD, an emotional outburst may be triggered by changes in the daily routine or by a cognitive or sensory overload, while in BPD, it may be triggered by, like I said, attachment issues, right? Let's talk a little bit more now about the similarities. Furthermore, a variety of studies have reported that not only could many BPD traits be considered a consequence of emotional dysregulation, a dimension also largely represented in autism subjects, but also that people with borderline show difficulties in identifying, distinguishing, and integrating their emotions with those of other individuals. What we're getting at here is the concept of theory of mind. While impaired social and relational areas may be a common core for both ASD and BPD, some authors stressed in borderline subjects difficulties in theory of mind similar to those typical of ASD. And quick reminder, what is theory of mind? The theory of mind is really about this idea that we need the ability, theoretically, to function well, to be able to infer and understand another person's mental state, right? Not just ours, but their beliefs, their thoughts, their intentions, and feelings of others, and to use this information to engage, predict, all of that. And so if I can't if I can only see mine and I can't see yours, that's going to somehow limit or impair my capacity to have a reciprocal relationship, that not everything is about me, that you are separate, you have separate thoughts and feelings and intentions and emotions. And knowing that and being able to separate that from my own are important. Well, why is it a problem? Because in borderline, because they're scanning for that fear of rejection and abandonment and all of that, it's almost like they only see the world oftentimes through their lens. I've often said that my mom really struggled to own her part in things. And we know that that limited self-awareness and rigidity in any disorder, but especially in the PDs, can be a challenge when they can't really see their part in something, right? It's like, well, you hurt me. It's like, well, I did hurt you, but I didn't mean to, and here's why. That part, it's hard sometimes depending upon where you function to get that. The same thing could be true in autism, where that theory of mind could be difficult because you're struggling to fully take in, the social cues, what that behavior meant, what their intentions were. There can be some fractures in that. And so in that regard, they can be very similar. And it says this is particularly relevant since altered social perception, what I just described, and altered functioning of more sophisticated neurocognitive skills such as theory of mind and associated mentalizing, which is basically the capacity to predict another person's conduct based upon their mental state, may lead in both BPD and ASD patients to emotional disturbances and impulsive and self-destructive behaviors. So if that theory of mind is not quite functioning well for borderline and autistic people in different ways, that might drive their emotionality or their ability to manage that, their impulsivity, decision-making, and even self-destructive behaviors. Additionally, both borderline and autism symptoms have been reported to improve after therapeutic interventions that target emotion recognition, mentalizing, and empathy, such as theory of mind and mentalization-based psychotherapy. A possible explanation for this concordance could be that the neurocognitive aspects of autism that are impaired, such as mentalizing, impulse control, empathy, and communication, may have a major influence on how personality develops, right? So don't forget, the PDs are personality disorders. It's like they're who you are in some way. They're not changing with the weather. It's so like these are all connected, right? So if as your personality is forming, there's an impairment in things alongside trauma, which we can expect, but even let's say more home trauma, attachment trauma, they all start to kind of go like this autism and borderline piece. And then it talks about some more differences. So let's look at those right now. So I pulled this from this research article I have down below, and I think on neurodivergentinsights.com, I know there's a similar version with a few more things, but this one is straight from this research article. And it separates borderline and autism, and then we have the overlap in the middle. So with borderline, we're talking about difficulty around self-image, desperate attempts to avoid abandonment, emotional upset when triggered by attachment issues, going back to that example, pervasive instability of the relationship dynamics, and feelings of emptiness. Like these are the bare minimum here. For autism, that wouldn't happen in borderline. We have this hyper or hypo sensitivity, so kind of like high or low sensitivity to sensory stimulation, all kinds of things. Emotional upset being triggered by changes in daily routine or by cognitive or sensory overload, as I mentioned. Repetitive behaviors, I would argue also strong routine preferences, and restricted special interests, things like that. So those kind of differentiate autism. Now, here's where you can see where it gets really kind of overwhelming, where this overlap, this clinical picture, if you're not really having the tools, which we don't necessarily have as many as we could or anywhere close, could say, oh, that's borderline, when actually there could be some borderline traits, but really it's about autism, for example. So number one, there can be in both populations and especially combined, a higher risk for self-wounding, emotional dysregulation, could be quite common, impairment in verbal and nonverbal communications and social functioning. So a situation here where we're making assumptions about what someone does or what they think or feel, and that's driving our meltdowns. But you can see why, as I mentioned earlier, is it a social cue issue? Is it a looking for wound issue? Is it both? Things like that. Difficulties in theory of mind. We can see superficial friendships, intense relationships, and a tendency to act out instead of verbalizing emotion. And we know one of the common dynamics with autism can be a difficulty identifying emotions, especially when they're happening, for example. So there could be this compulsion or responsiveness to just act out the feeling for both of them for similar but different reasons. Now, some of the literature reviews, one of them talked about this idea that the presence of ASD and BPD in patients in general, the comorbid when they have both basically, resulted in lower mentalizing capacity and lower social functioning that possibly leads to higher levels of anxiety due to interpersonal problems and a compromised self-image. These data may also support the hypothesis of a greater misdiagnosis among ASD women. It can then be inferred that disorders such as BPD can mask the presence of autism, especially in women, who are more likely than men to repress any autistic traits by mimicking normal behavior. So all of that social camouflaging I was just talking about in my last video around masking and compensation, assimilation, all of those things. And that's the problem with us being diagnosed, is that we don't even present in many ways like the previous clinical pictures that we see in the DSM. There can be some similarities, but there's a lot of differences that we haven't yet identified. And I will say this, as I keep saying in every video I make about this, this is what we know right now. There's so much more we don't know. There are things I may have left out that I don't know yet, and things may evolve. So always hold that in mind. I still keep saying we're at this beginning of understanding, especially autism, but all of this as it plays out with trauma, borderline autism, etc. Now there's some more research here that just talks about this concept that also they started expanding understanding autism through the lens of clinical and subclinical traits. I think that may align more with the previous Asperger's dynamic, but that basically there are those who can have these not quite meeting the criteria for autism, but subclinical, so just below the clinical requirements, that often have this overlayer with prevalence of borderline that we can see. So like a lot more borderline symptoms in many of those who also have some subclinical traits of autism. And that these data should be considered in light of the recent literature which focused on possible causes of under-recognition of autism among females, hypothesizing that females may undergo, like I just said, greater societal pressure to conform and be more motivated to camouflage. So there it is again, that inherent piece of obviously high masking enough, and they use the words high functioning here. I know we don't love those words. That's in the research still. But this idea that in some ways, the more you're able to be aware, even if you can't switch it around, you know what's happening enough to try to hide it because you've experienced enough to know that that isn't accepted and that's rejected. So you're more motivated to camouflage. And when you've always been doing that, trying to unmask and pull that apart can not only make a diagnosis difficult, but make it difficult to see in yourself. It's like you don't know how to be any other way in the world that doesn't involve camouflaging in some way. Another major link is this relationship between BPD and ASD and trauma, as I was saying. And so it says, another major link is how this trauma piece, there's an increased vulnerability to experience trauma when you have autism. And that these studies are focusing on the correlations between high autistic traits and the likelihood of harm are still scarce. A growing body of evidence is reporting how individuals with autism spectrum conditions often suffer from bullying, interpersonal trauma, violence, and other forms of wounding. So there's this vulnerability. That's what we've been talking so much about. Can you have autism without trauma? You really can't, right? The research shows that even if somehow you have the perfect world, as I've said, at home, that the world inherently will be traumatic in other ways. And so there's also an increased vulnerability just in general to how you perceive and deal with trauma and vulnerabilities because of the way maybe you lack social cues or things like that, or how you interpret or don't interpret verbal, nonverbal communication and all of that. Because we know that those with autism are much more likely to be victims of violence and all of those types of things of trauma. On the other hand, traumatic events such as episodes of harm are also frequently reported by borderline patients. And furthermore, higher levels of autistic traits have been reported in borderline subjects who suffered from harm, either I'm going to leave it here, than those without a history of trauma, right? So we're saying even those with borderline often have, as you add the other side of it, if it's undetected autism, that also impacts their experience or risk. So it's like these two things are holding hands. A possible explanation of this data can be that subjects with high autistic traits, either picturing a full-blown or sub-threshold disorder, may not only face a higher risk of exposure to trauma, but also have an increased vulnerability to the effects of the event, resulting in the manifestation of post-traumatic symptoms and BPD-like characteristics. Okay, so we're talking about both of them having this increased vulnerability. And with the last card, I want to share this. It says this, and I highlighted here. It says, noticeably, more vulnerable subjects, such as individuals in the autism spectrum, suffering from chronic exposure to traumatic events, even interpersonal, can develop a peculiar post-traumatic phenotype known as complex PTSD, CPTSD, distinguished by the presence of emotional liability, long-term instability in interpersonal relationships, negative self-perception, and maladaptive behaviors that can be easily misdiagnosed as BPD. So it's saying those with autism, with relational trauma, it's very common to have complex trauma with autism, and that can be easily misdiagnosed as BPD, further enhancing the risk of a BPD diagnosis, which would mean an underlying autism spectrum, especially among women. So this is why I think it's so fascinating that this, like my mom, for example, I can break it down this way. I go, okay, to my knowledge, outside of which may have been her mom, who I think my grandmother, who I adore, but who died when I was like 8 or 9, maybe she had some yelling anger issues, but there was no like big trauma. My mom was like homecoming queen in a very small farm town and head cheerleader, which if she was masking, she had mastered pretty well, which is also possible. But the parts that feel very borderline are the fear of abandonment. Like that piece was huge. There was some impulsivity there. That's also borderline. I never saw any of the sensory triggers. I mean, she was excellent at putting the mask on in social situations, but I didn't see repetitive behaviors. I didn't see special interests. I didn't see strong preference for routines. And I certainly didn't see, this piece around, my light's missing, I just realized. I didn't see this piece around, pop it back on. I have been making this video 3 times today in between clients. Okay. I didn't see the piece around the sensory issues, those types of things, but it does have a strong flavor of borderline. And so is it possible that autism is in there? Absolutely it is, but the primary manifestations feel very borderline driven. And even her brothers, as I've said, have said, yeah, she was kind of always like that. Do I see, some autistic things in the family? Maybe on that side. But as I've said, I don't have any of that biological history, so I don't really know. Maybe someday I will. But the point is that all of this gets really complicated. And what I thought was interesting is that these articles talked about things like mentalization-based treatments being really helpful for both autism and borderline. And most of the stuff I've seen has been talking more about like body therapies, nervous system regulation. And I just found some stuff on borderline and mentalization, which I do talk about in my other courses, and I got another book on it. And so I'm going to share more about mentalization-based techniques here in the future, which it seems like could be helpful for both autism, high masking autism, and borderline, in addition to body-based therapies, somatic therapies, trauma therapies, and things like that. But I just thought that last part was like, oh my gosh, like this whole complex trauma piece, when you already have autism, seems to hold hands, which can then get translated into a borderline diagnosis. And I know there have been many people on my pages who have said, I was, diagnosed as borderline at the age of 20, and now at 50, I know it's autism, right? So that diagnosis is only going to get you so far in treatment if the underlying piece is more of this developmental piece that has never been treated. So I know I got kind of talking fast here, and I'm in my more elevated self today, but I really wanted to share this, and I'm trying to get back on a schedule here. As you know, I do it for a while and then I don't do it. But anyway, that's my goal, and I hope that you find it helpful. I hope that you will look further into these dynamics. Borderline involves a lot more than what I mentioned today. There are 9 basic symptomatology, and you must meet 5 for a diagnosis. I'll pop a card up here at the end, actually, just for you to look at that, and a quick summary of autism. But I think that it can help fuel further exploration. So, and the last thing I'll say is, I think too that when I mentioned in the beginning how the clinical picture can look like meltdowns, dysregulation, social issues, anxiety, like those can be so similar. It's easy to see, especially why now, when we're just now beginning to understand this female phenotype, which definitely seems to be emerging more and more. And I know there's some conversation around not calling it female autism, but I just feel pulled to say that because of the way we are socialized, that there's a specific clinical picture, I feel like that's important. And if I hadn't seen the criteria on female autism, I don't think I would have ever discovered any of this. And so I just think that we're still learning a lot about it. It isn't to remove those that don't like technically fit under that window, that anyone can have this presentation regardless of how you identify, but that there is a specific way it can manifest. And I'm sure that will also apply to certain communities of color, certain, regions, like based on the social expectations. But I think all across the world, more often than not, women and girls are expected to engage in the world in at least a much more similar way than the white males who have been studied. Anyway, that's all I want to say. So anyway, thank you so much for being here. Please stay safe and well, and I'll see you soon.